Good morning everyone. We, Group 3, would like to lead the discussion of this week with the topic of competitive dynamics. What is competitive dynamics?
Competitive dynamics is the analysis of competition at the action and response level to predict how a firm will act or react against opponents.
In the section 4, we divide our speech into two parts: action characteristics as predictors of competitive response, and the second part is competitive attack, retaliation and performance, an expectancy valence framework.
Among those who has contributed for this research as author would be Mr. Professor Chen Ming-Che, professor at the Darden School. Is a leading authority in strategic management. He is recognized for his pioneering work in competitive dynamics and ambulatory management, president and fellow of the Academy of Management, a fellow of the Strategic Management Society and former chair of the Academy's Business Policy and Strategy Division.
Starting the first paper, Action Characteristics as Predictors of Competitive Response, was issued by Mr. Ming-Che Chen, Mr. Ken G. Smith and Curtis M. Graham.
Here are a couple of contents for the discussion, including the objective of this paper, the characteristics of action and response, hypothesis and methods, and results.
The main purposes for this research are: first, to highlight the significance of responses in competitive dynamics while proposing two important response attributes. Second, to investigate the competitive implications of various attributes of action. And the last one is to demonstrate that competitive responses may be predicted based on the characteristics of the initial actions. Moving on, the first paper with a central question in competitive dynamics is whether a competitive response can be predicted.
As the game tree in Figure 1, when a firm initiates an action, its competitors may have two options in reacting: decide either to response or not to response.
An action is defined as a specific and detectable competitive move, such as new product introduction, initiated by a firm to improve or defend its relative competitive position.
A response is an observed and discerned counteraction taken by a competing firm to defend or improve its relative position.
Obviously, the characteristics of actions was mentioned as below. Competitive impact: the pervasiveness of an action's effect on competitors. Attack intensity: the extent to which an action affects a given competitor's key markets. Implementation requirement: the degree of effort an initiating firm requires to execute an action. Type of action: strategic versus tactical.
The next will also be the characteristics of responses. Number of responses: total number of competitors who actually respond to an action. Response lag: the length of time a competitor takes to respond to an initiator's competitive action.
The important elements: awareness, motivation, and capability provide a theoretical underpinning for studying the relationships between characteristics of actions and responses, as you see in the framework. A1. Tactical action with large competitive impact, strong attack intensity, and low implementation requirement. A2. Strategic action with small competitive impact, weak attack intensity, and high implementation requirement.
R1. Quick response. R2. Slow response.
In order to clarify which hypothesis related to, the author has divided carefully into four groups related to. The hypotheses developed below, which reflect this stimulus-response process, are organized in terms of four characteristics of actions.
Group 1. Competitive impact. Hypothesis 1. The greater the competitive impact of an action, the greater the number of responses. Hypothesis 2. The greater the competitive impact of an action, the faster the response's attack intensity.
Group 2. Attack intensity. Hypothesis 3. The greater the action's average attack intensity, the greater the number of responses. Hypothesis 4. The greater the action's attack intensity, the faster the responses.
Group 3. Implementation requirement. Hypothesis 5. The greater the action's implementation requirement, the smaller the number of responses. Hypothesis 6. The greater the action's implementation requirement, the slower the responses.
And the last group of hypothesis will be type of action. Hypothesis 7. Strategic actions, relative to tactical ones. will provoke fewer responses. Hypothesis 8. Strategic actions, relative to tactical ones, will provoke slower responses. Before moving to the next paper, and in order to know clearly for about above information, just be taken note that the hypothesized relationships were tested with a sample of competitive moves among U.S. airlines. The information on airline competition was from Aviation Daily, a 50-year-old industry journal, and interviewing of airline executives and industry analysts.
The results showed that all the hypotheses were supported except Hypothesis 2 and Hypothesis 4. Specifically, the total number of competitors affected by an action and these competitors of the markets under attack by the actions increase the number of competitive responses. Strategic, as opposed to tactical or actions which require substantial implementation efforts, reduce the number and delay timing of rivals' counteractions. Finally, contrary to prediction, competitors who have a high stake in the markets under attack by a competitive move react slowly.
Another paper to introduce today is Competitive Attack, Retaliation, and Performance. An expectancy valence framework was published by Mr. Ming-Jer Chen and Danny Miller, examining how competitive attacks can best reduce the chances of retaliation, and it seeks to identify just what it is about attack behavior that elicits or averts retaliatory responses. And it goes on to explore the performance implications of retaliation.
In order to know more, just check the two modes of attack, subtle attack strategy and brute force strategy. For competitive contexts in which no rival clearly dominates, a subtle attack strategy is expected, on average, to be far more effective than a brute force strategy.
The brute attack is much more likely to avoid retaliation and de-escalating competition that impoverishes all competitors.
The superiority of subtle over brute force attack as a mean of limiting retaliation can be derived from the well-known expectancy valence model of motivation.
The strategists might do well to eschew overt attacks in favor of subtle ones that, first of all, minimize visibility. The next is minimize rivals' perceived ability to respond effectively. Finally, diminish the valence or value that rivals assign to effective retaliation. In order to make the transition from the motivational psychology of individuals to the behavior of corporations, by using expectancy valence model by Levroux, 1964.
This research focused on the three factors, attack visibility, response difficulty, and attack centrality, that are expected to influence retaliation. The research also argued that retaliation will hurt financial performance.
Let's take a glance at visibility of attack. Hypothesis 1 is the more visible the attack, the larger the number of retaliatory responses from the group of rivals being attacked.
Next, moving to the next factor, which is response difficulty. H2 was developed as the more difficult it is to respond to an attack, the smaller the number of retaliatory responses. And the last factor should have to mention is centrality of attack. H3 was as the greater the centrality of the markets attacked, the greater the number of retaliatory responses.
Based on the expectancy valence theory, let's check the relationship between response difficulty and attack centrality as the multiplicative relationship.
Hypothesis 4, the first order and second order products of responses, attack visibility, and attack centrality will be positively correlated with the number of responses.
And the last hypothesis will be withdrawn by the relationship between attack, retaliation, and performance.
H5, the extent to which a firm's actions will provoke retaliation will be negatively related to performance.
After checking all the hypotheses above, just moving to the example and the interaction effects, the sample consisted of 32 major U.S. airlines. The information on airline competition was from Aviation Daily, a 50-year-old industry journal, and interviewing of airline executives and industry analysts. This research used methods of structured content analysis to identify and classify these moves. Author's central thesis was that subtle attacks would provoke fewer responses, more visible, more central, and more easily imitated volleys.
This was confirmed. H13 was supported. They show that all three aspects of subtlety, visibility, difficulty, and centrality bear the expected relationships to response.
Two of the expectancy valence interactions of H4 materialized, but only very weak.
and H5 was borne out as well, suggesting a consistently negative relationship between profitability and the response ratio. Last but not least, the research suggests that in order to succeed, organizations must avoid being retaliated against.
And this in turn requires that their attacks be subtle enough along all three components of the expectancy valence model to minimize rivals' incentives to respond, while at the same time being sufficiently potent to produce significant benefits. Stealth, complexity, and obliqueness may all be required to make an attack sufficiently subtle to succeed. That's all our group's presentation. Thanks for watching.